They spit on me at the airport. That's not a metaphor. A woman in a tie-dye shirt actually spit on my uniform while I was waiting for my duffel bag at the carousel in San Francisco. Called me a baby killer. I was 20 years old, weighed maybe 140 pounds after a year in the jungle. Still had the shakes from my last firefight 3 days prior. I just stood there. Didn't know what to say. Didn't know what to do. Welcome home. My name is David Chen. Chinese-American kid from Sacramento, drafted in 1968, right after I graduated high school. I didn't want to go. Had plans for community college, maybe become an electrician like my uncle. But the draft board didn't care about my plans. You got your notice, you went. That's how it worked if you weren't rich enough for college deferments or connected enough for the National Guard. Basic training at Fort Ord, infantry training at Fort Polk, then Vietnam. They shipped us over in July 1968, right after Tet. The country was still reeling from that offensive, still trying to pretend we were winning, even though everyone knew we weren't. They sent me to the Central Highlands with the 4th Infantry Division. 13 months in hell, then back to the world. But the world didn't want me back. I grew up thinking soldiers were heroes. My grandfather fought in World War II, helped liberate concentration camps. He had photos from VE Day, ticker tape parades, people celebrating in the streets. He told me stories about coming home, about how grateful people were. I thought that's what war was. You go, you fight, you come home to parades and pretty girls and everybody thanking you. Vietnam wasn't like that. Nobody told us before we went. They didn't warn us that this war was different, that people back home were turning against it, that by the time we got back, we'd be viewed as the villains instead of the heroes. We found out through letters from home, through rumors, through the growing sense that something was shifting back in the States. But you're in the jungle, you're fighting, you're trying to survive. You don't have time to think about politics or protests or what the folks at home think about the war. You just try not to die. I did my job. Walked point sometimes, humped the 60, pulled ambush duty, went on search and destroy missions that rarely found anything worth destroying. Lost friends, killed people, enemy soldiers, I think. Though in that war it was hard to tell sometimes. Came back with minor wounds, major trauma, and a head full of memories I didn't want. The plane landed at Travis Air Force Base on August 15th, 1969. I'd been counting down the days for months, dreaming about home, about real food, about sleeping without one eye open, listening for mortars. But when we landed, when I walked off that plane in my dress uniform with my ribbons and my duffel bag, there were protesters at the fence, shouting at us, calling us murderers. I thought they were joking at first, some kind of sick prank, but they weren't joking. The Army processed us out quickly, too quickly. One day you're in a combat zone, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every possible threat. 48 hours later, you're standing in an airport in California, surrounded by civilians who look at you like you're contaminated. I called my parents from a payphone. My mom cried. My dad asked if I was okay. I lied and said yes. They wanted to pick me up, but I told them I'd take the bus to Sacramento. I needed time to adjust, to process, to figure out how to be a civilian again. The bus ride was surreal. I was still in uniform. They'd told us to change into civilian clothes, but I didn't have any that fit anymore. I'd lost weight. My old clothes were back home. So I wore the uniform. Big mistake. People stared. Not the grateful, respectful stares I'd imagined. Cold stares. Hostile stares. A middle-aged man sitting across from me saw my combat infantryman badge and shook his head in disgust. Muttered something about baby killers loud enough for me to hear. I wanted to scream at him. Tell him I'd never hurt a civilian. Tell him about the village we'd helped rebuild after a VC attack. Tell him about Martinez carrying a wounded Vietnamese kid 3 miles to a medevac. but I didn't. I just stared out the window and tried to make myself smaller. Got to Sacramento around 8 p.m. My parents were waiting at the bus station. My mom hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. My dad shook my hand, gripped my shoulder, tried not to cry. They drove me home, and I sat in the back seat of their Chevy like a stranger. Everything looked different, too clean, too organized, too normal. The neighborhood had a banner, "Welcome Home, David." My mom had organized it with the neighbors, but I could see some of them looking uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. The Hendersons from next door didn't come out. Neither did the Millers. My mom made excuses. They were busy, they were traveling, but I knew. They didn't want to celebrate a Vietnam veteran. That night I couldn't sleep in my old bed. Too soft, too quiet. I ended up on the floor with my back against the wall, jumping at every car that passed, every dog that barked. My dad found me at 3 a.m. sitting in the dark. "You okay, son?" I wasn't, but I said yes. What else could I say? The next week was worse than any firefight I'd been in. At least in Vietnam, you knew who the enemy was. Back home, the hostility was everywhere but invisible, hidden in looks, in silences, in the way conversations stopped when I entered a room. I went to the VA to register for benefits. The waiting room was full of Vietnam vets, all of us looking shell-shocked and lost. We didn't talk to each other, just sat there staring at nothing, waiting to be processed like cattle. The clerk who handled my paperwork was maybe 50, probably a Korean War vet. He looked at me with something between pity and contempt. "Good luck finding work," he said as he handed me my forms. "Nobody's hiring Vietnam vets right now." He wasn't wrong. I spent 2 weeks applying for jobs. Mechanic shops, construction crews, warehouses, anywhere that would take someone with just a high school diploma and infantry training. Most places didn't even call back. The ones that interviewed me got awkward when they saw U.S. Army 1968 to 1969 on my application. One manager was honest about it. "Look, kid, I believe you're a good worker, but I got customers, I got employees, and a lot of them have strong feelings about the war. It's not worth the hassle." So I was unhireable. Too young for Social Security, too old to go back to high school, too traumatized for college, and too controversial for regular employment. I started drinking. Not heavily at first, just a beer with dinner. Then 2, then 3. Then I'd drink until I could sleep without the nightmares. My parents tried to understand, but they couldn't. How could they? My dad would ask me about the war, and I couldn't tell him. Couldn't describe the things I'd seen, the things I'd done. When I stayed silent, he thought I was being disrespectful. When I tried to talk about it, he'd get this look on his face, horror, disgust, disappointment, and I'd stop. My mom tried to fix me with home cooking and normalcy, made all my favorite meals, invited relatives over, tried to recreate the life I'd had before. But I wasn't the same person. The kid who'd left Sacramento in 1968 died in Vietnam. What came back was someone else wearing his face. I ran into my high school girlfriend at the grocery store in September. Lisa Chen, no relation, despite the same last name. We'd been together for 2 years before I got drafted, wrote letters back and forth for a while, but they'd stopped coming around month 8. Now I knew why. She was with someone else. A guy with long hair and a peace sign on his jacket. When she saw me, she actually flinched, like I'd hit her or something. "David," she said, and her voice was cold. "You're back." "Yeah." Awkward silence. Her boyfriend looked me up and down with obvious disgust. "I'm glad you made it home safe," she said, but she didn't mean it. "I have to go." They left, and I stood there in the produce aisle, holding a bag of oranges, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in the jungle. The worst part was the silence. Nobody wanted to hear about Vietnam. If I tried to talk about it, people changed the subject. If I mentioned I was a veteran, they'd make excuses and leave. It was like I'd contracted some disease and everyone was afraid of catching it. I started having panic attacks. Loud noises would send me diving for cover. Helicopters overhead would trigger flashbacks. I'd smell something, diesel fuel, burning garbage, certain foods, and suddenly I'd be back in the Central Highlands, heart racing, hands shaking, unable to breathe. My parents finally insisted I see a doctor. The VA psychiatrist was overwhelmed, seeing dozens of vets a week, all with similar problems. He diagnosed me with adjustment disorder and prescribed Valium. Told me it would take time to readjust. But how do you adjust to being treated like a war criminal when you were just doing what your country asked you to do? By October, I'd stopped looking for regular work. Started doing odd jobs, cash under the table, anything to pay for food and beer. My parents wanted me to move out. Not because they didn't love me, but because they thought independence would help. I found a studio apartment in a bad part of town, cheap rent, no questions asked. The isolation was crushing, but also comforting. At least alone, I didn't have to pretend to be okay. Didn't have to see the disappointment in people's eyes. Didn't have to hear the protesters on the news calling guys like me war criminals. I met other Vietnam vets at the VA, at dive bars, on street corners. We recognized each other instantly. Something in the eyes, the posture, the way we scanned rooms for exits. We'd talk sometimes, swap stories, share our anger and confusion, but mostly we just drank together in silence. What was there to say that we didn't already know? One guy, Tommy Williams, had been a door gunner with the 1st Cavalry. He told me about coming home to Denver, how his own brother refused to shake his hand. Called him a murderer, said he should have gone to Canada like his friends. Tommy tried to explain that he'd been drafted, didn't have a choice, but his brother didn't want to hear it. Far as he's concerned, Tommy said, I could have run, could have gone to jail, could have done anything except go to Vietnam, so it's my fault. Tommy shot himself in 1971. I heard about it through another vet. They found him in his apartment, service pistol, no note. He was 23 years old. I thought about it sometimes. Not constantly, but the idea was there, lurking in the background. What was I living for? To work shitty jobs nobody else wanted? To be spit on and called a baby killer? To spend the rest of my life haunted by memories of things I couldn't talk about? But I was too stubborn to do it. Or too scared, or maybe some part of me still hoped things would get better. The news was constant. Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, the images from My Lai finally getting mainstream coverage. Every new revelation made it worse for us, made people more convinced that everyone who went to Vietnam was a monster. They couldn't separate the policy from the soldiers, couldn't understand that most of us were just kids who got drafted, who did what we were told, who tried to survive a nightmare we didn't create. I started avoiding the news, stopped reading newspapers, stopped watching TV. What was the point? Every story about Vietnam just made the public hate us more. In 1972, I finally got a steady job at a warehouse. The owner was a World War II vet who believed in giving Vietnam vets a chance. It was hard work, long hours, bad pay, but it was something. I worked there for 3 years, kept my head down, didn't talk about my service. My co-workers found out anyway. Someone saw my military ID when I was getting my driver's license renewed. After that, things got tense. Nobody said anything directly, but I could feel the shift. The cold shoulders, the exclusion from after-work drinks, the way conversations stopped when I approached. I quit in 1975, right after Saigon fell. Couldn't handle it anymore. Couldn't handle watching people celebrate the end of the war like it was a victory, like all the guys who died over there meant nothing, like our sacrifice was just a national embarrassment to be forgotten as quickly as possible. The late 70s were a blur of depression, alcohol, and dead-end jobs. I drifted from one thing to another, never staying anywhere long, never letting anyone get close. Relationships were impossible. How do you explain your nightmares to someone who thinks you're a war criminal? How do you open up when the whole country wants you to just disappear? I hit rock bottom in 1978, lost my job, lost my apartment, ended up living in my car for 2 months. The VA had programs, but they were overwhelmed, underfunded, staffed by people who didn't understand what we were going through. I'd go in for help, and they'd give me pamphlets about job training and coping mechanisms. What I needed was someone to acknowledge that we'd been abandoned, that we'd been used and discarded and blamed for a war we didn't start. One night I was drunk, sitting in my car outside a VFW hall, and a Korean War vet knocked on my window. His name was Frank Sullivan, must have been in his 50s. He looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "You a Vietnam vet?" I nodded. "Come inside. You shouldn't be alone." The VFW guys were different. Older vets who'd seen their own share of shit, who understood what it meant to come home to a country that didn't know what to do with you. They didn't judge, didn't ask questions, just gave me coffee and let me sit in the corner until I was sober enough to drive. Frank became something of a mentor. He'd been at Incheon and Chosin Reservoir, knew about cold and death and the way war changes you. "It gets easier," he told me one night. "Not better, but easier. You learn to live with it. You learn to function." "How long does that take?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "I'll let you know when I get there." Through the VFW, I met other Vietnam vets who were trying to get their lives together. We started meeting informally, just talking, sharing our experiences. It helped having people who understood, who didn't judge, who knew what it was like to be hated for serving your country. But the anger never went away. Anger at the government that sent us. Anger at the protesters who blamed us. Anger at the civilians who forgot us. Anger at ourselves for surviving when others didn't. It was corrosive, that anger. It ate away at everything. I started speaking at high schools in the early 80s. Some of the teachers wanted their students to hear from actual veterans instead of just reading about it in textbooks. It was hard, standing in front of kids barely younger than I'd been when I got drafted, trying to explain Vietnam, trying to make them understand that it wasn't black and white, that we weren't monsters, that we'd been lied to just like everyone else. Some kids listened. Others had already made up their minds that Vietnam vets were all damaged goods, best forgotten. I'd see it in their faces, the judgment, the dismissal. These were kids who weren't even born when I was in the jungle, and they'd already decided I was the bad guy. One kid asked me if I regretted going. I told him the truth. I regret that I was drafted. I regret that I had to go. But I don't regret serving with the men I served with. They were good men, heroes, most of them. They deserved better than what they got. "Did you kill anyone?" another kid asked. The teacher tried to stop the question, but I answered it. Yes, because if I didn't, they would have killed me or my friends. That's what war is. It's not glory or honor or any of the bullshit you see in movies. It's survival. And I survived. I'm 37 years old now, sitting here in 1985, and Vietnam still defines my life. 15 years since I came home, and I'm still fighting that war every single day. The nightmares haven't stopped. The hypervigilance hasn't stopped. The feeling of being an outsider in my own country hasn't stopped. I've had 2 failed marriages. Both women tried. They really did. But how do you love someone who wakes up screaming, who can't go to fireworks displays, who drinks too much and won't talk about why? They deserve better than what I could give them. I don't have kids. Can't imagine bringing a child into this world. Can't imagine being a father when I can barely take care of myself. Sometimes I see families in the park and I feel this ache of loss for a life I'll never have. The country is starting to change, slowly. There are Vietnam memorials being built, support groups forming, politicians acknowledging that maybe we treated the veterans like shit. But it's too late for guys like Tommy Williams. Too late for the thousands of Vietnam vets who killed themselves because they couldn't live with the rejection, the silence, the blame. I work security now, night shift at a hospital. It's quiet, solitary, gives me time to think. Sometimes too much time. I watch people come in with their emergencies, broken bones, heart attacks, babies being born. And I think about how normal their lives are, how they don't carry around the weight of being hated for doing what their country asked them to do. The VA finally recognized that what we were dealing with had a name. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It helps having a diagnosis, having something concrete to point to. But it doesn't fix anything, doesn't make the nightmares stop, doesn't make the memories fade, doesn't make civilians understand what we went through. I see the young guys going into the military now, and I want to warn them. Want to tell them that no matter what the recruiters promise, no matter what politicians say about honor and duty, there's a cost. And sometimes that cost is paid long after the war ends. Sometimes you pay it for the rest of your life. But I don't warn them. What right do I have? Maybe their wars will be different. Maybe they'll come home to parades and gratitude instead of spit and silence. Maybe they won't spend decades wondering why they bothered. I think about the guys I served with. Rodriguez, Jackson, Nguyen, Martinez. Some died over there. Some made it home and died here. Suicide, overdose, just giving up. The ones who survived are scattered across the country, all of us carrying the same weight, all of us wondering what it was for. Was Vietnam worth it? Did we accomplish anything? Did the 58,000 dead Americans and millions of dead Vietnamese serve any purpose? The answer is no. We lost. The communists won. Everything we fought for, everyone who died, it was all for nothing. But that's not what hurts the most. What hurts is that we were willing to pay that price. We answered when our country called, and our country responded by treating us like criminals, like embarrassments, like something to be hidden away and forgotten. I see politicians now talking about supporting the troops, about honoring veterans, about learning from Vietnam. But I don't trust it. I can't. Because I remember 1969. I remember being spit on in my uniform. I remember being called a baby killer by people who'd never been in a war, never had to make those impossible choices. You don't forget that. You can't forgive it. My parents are older now, trying to understand why their son came home broken and stayed broken. My mom still cries sometimes when she looks at me. She knows I'm not the boy she sent off to war. That boy died in Vietnam. What came back was a survivor, a ghost, a man permanently displaced in time. I go to the Vietnam Memorial when I can, the one they built in D.C. I find the names of the guys I served with, touch the cold stone, remember their faces. The memorial helps a little. It's an acknowledgement that we existed, that we mattered, that we weren't all monsters. But it doesn't change what I live with every day. The isolation, the anger, the sense of betrayal, the knowledge that I gave 2 years of my life to my country and got hatred in return. People ask me if I'd do it again, knowing what I know now. The answer is complicated. I wouldn't volunteer. I'd run to Canada if I could go back. Not because I'm a coward, but because I know now that the war wasn't worth what it cost. That the government lied. That we were sent to die for nothing. But if I was drafted again, if I had to choose between jail and service, I'd probably go. Not for the country that abandoned me, for the guys next to me, for the men who didn't have a choice, who did their best in an impossible situation, for the Rodriguezes and Jacksons and Martinezes who deserved someone fighting alongside them. That's the tragedy of Vietnam. We didn't fight for America. We fought for each other. And it still wasn't enough to save us. I'm alive. I have a job, a small apartment, some friends at the VFW who understand. By most measures, I'm a success story. I didn't end up homeless, didn't kill myself, didn't end up in prison. But I'm not really living. I'm existing, going through the motions, waiting for something that's never going to come. They told us we were fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the American way. What they didn't tell us is that when we came home, we'd be prisoners. Prisoners of our memories, our trauma, our country's rejection. I survived Vietnam, but Vietnam didn't let me go. Some of us made it home, but none of us came back. Interview recorded March 1985, Sacramento, California.